Hello, friends. Dave Bjork here, lung cancer survivor, patient advocate, and host of the Research Evangelist podcast. Just got back from the ASCO annual meeting, the largest oncology conference in the world. I attended a lot of the abstracts and presentations and would like to share some of the key, exciting lung cancer research that was presented. To do that, I've invited Dr. Nasser Hanna, my friend and brilliant thoracic medical oncologist from the Indiana University Simon Comprehensive Cancer Center, to share his key takeaways from the conference. Dr. Hanna, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe we can just start by let's have you tell us maybe three research presentations or that you are super excited about that we can share with my audience.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So this year's ASCO had so many important studies, but if we had to limit it to three, I would first start with one of the studies that was presented in the plenary session. This was a randomized phase 3 study of patients with early stage non-small cell lung cancer whose tumors harbored a RET fusion. And the study evaluated the role of adjuvant selpercatinib, which is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor to RET, versus adjuvant chemotherapy. And this is a similar trial design to studies that have looked at adjuvant therapy against EGFR and adjuvant therapy against ALK. In this case, the gene abnormality is RET. And similar to studies of adjuvant EGFR therapy and adjuvant ALK therapy, the use of an adjuvant RET inhibitor dramatically reduced the likelihood of cancer recurring. So we call that disease-free survival. We usually celebrate if we can reduce the risk of recurrence by 20, 30%. This study demonstrated that you could reduce the risk of recurrence by approximately 80%. This is a very stunning
Wow.
finding, and it's consistent with those other studies. So it really helps us celebrate the science of sequencing someone's tumor DNA, developing drugs that place a brake on the abnormal activity happening in certain segments of the DNA, first demonstrating that that's an effective approach at helping people whose cancer is already stage 4, not curing that cancer, but helping to control it for longer. And now incorporating those drugs in a potentially curable population and showing dramatic reductions in the risk of recurrence. So I think that is one of my biggest highlights and really does underscore how the science translates into real world results for patients. A second study that I think is really important was also presented in the plenary session of ASCO. And this was a study of patients who have stage 4 squamous cell lung cancer. Now, in some parts of the world, squamous cell lung cancer is more common than it is here in the United States. In the United States, about 15% of people with lung cancer have squamous cell subtype. In other parts of the world, it still remains 30 to 40%. Now, for men in China, squamous cell cancer is still a very common subtype of lung cancer. And there was a randomized phase 3 trial conducted in China. It was called Harmony 6. It was for patients who had stage 4 squamous cell lung cancer. They were allowed to enter the study regardless of what the PD-L1 status was of their tumor. And they were randomized to a control arm of chemotherapy plus a PD-1 inhibitor, commonly used in China, versus chemotherapy plus ivonescimab. Now, ivonescimab is an antibody to two targets. One is PD-1 and the other is VEGF. And there's a lot of data that suggests that dual inhibition of VEGF and PD-1 can have a greater anti-cancer effect than inhibiting just one of those targets alone. So, what did this study show? The study showed that those individuals who received the ivonescimab with the chemo had prolonged what we call progression-free survival, nearly doubling the time it took for the cancer to progress in patients. And importantly, that translated into people living longer. The probability of living longer at a year and beyond was substantially higher. It was about a 35% higher likelihood of being alive if you were receiving ivonescimab. Now, when we dive into the details of this study, we want to look at the PD1 status, PDL1 status. And that's because for this population of patients with squamous cell cancer, while chemotherapy plus a PD1 inhibitor is standard treatment in the United States, the subset of patients with PDL1 negative tumors doesn't really seem to do that well. Now, we also have an option in the United States of giving these patients chemotherapy plus combination immunotherapy. So in the US, that's usually nivolumab plus ipilimumab. That does seem to positively affect that PDL1 less than 1% population. However, that combination of therapies comes with a price. There are significant side effects related to that. About a third of individuals receiving that regimen have serious side effects that require hospitalization and high dose steroids. We don't really see that safety challenge with the drug ivonescimab. So this is a very important study. It's hard to find drugs that improve treatment over our current standards. I think we have found one. Now, one of the things that people want to do is to understand how that study fits into the context of other studies with that drug. And it turns out that we have two additional positive randomized phase 3 studies of ivonescimab. One of those studies is a head-to-head comparison of ivonescimab versus pembrolizumab in patients with stage 4 lung cancer whose PD-L1 score is 50% or higher. And in that study, those on ivonescimab had a significantly longer time to disease progression. Similarly, in a study of patients who have EGFR mutations who have already progressed on EGFR therapy, they were randomized to receive chemotherapy or chemotherapy plus ivonescimab. And in that study, once again, the addition of ivonescimab improved the time for patients' disease to progress. So we're seeing consistent results. We're seeing 3 trials now in 3 different settings, all of which are positive. And this is the first study in squamous cell cancer, which is positive. So I think that that is a substantial finding, and more studies are going to be done and are ongoing. Some argue that those studies need to be done in North America and in Western populations to understand its safety profile and its efficacy in this population. And those studies will be done. And I think those studies are likely going to reproduce the positive results that we're already seeing. So those to me are the top 2 studies from ASCO. There were a number of other important studies. If you, had me just name one additional study, I do think that there was a positive randomized phase 3 study in patients with a subset of EGFR mutations. These are called exon 20 insertion mutations. 90% of people who have tumors with EGFR mutations have them in one of 2 locations: deletions in exon 19 or a mutation in exon 21 called L858R. But some patients have a mutation in a different part of the EGFR gene that's called the exon 20, and these are what are called insertion mutations. These tumors are harder to inhibit with our usual TKIs that we have, drugs like osimertinib. So at this year's ASCO, there was a randomized phase 3 study evaluating the drug sunvozertinib. And sunvozertinib is an EGFR tyrosine kinase inhibitor, uniquely active against those who have the exon 20 insertion mutations. And in that study, patients were compared to those who received chemotherapy with or without immunotherapy. And not only were response rates much higher for sunvosertinib, but progression-free survival was longer and survival appears to be longer as well. So this is again another advance in a population of patients with targeted therapy. So those are the three big ones. Incorporating targeted therapy in the earlier stage setting, we have another success along with EGFR and ALK. We now have RET. Perhaps moving the bar in patients who generally are receiving immunotherapy, and that's with the drug ivonescimab, a dual inhibitor of VEGF and PD-1, perhaps moving the bar against just PD-1 inhibition alone. And then another example of advancing the science in metastatic disease in a patient with a molecular target.
That's
And by no means are those the only three studies.
no,
Those are my three top studies, but there are about 6 to 8 additional studies that I think move the needle as well.
well, I think that's really exciting for patients. And, you mentioned, the squamous cell being 15% of in lung cancer. That's still a big number, you know. But even if it's for small populations, I know people like you care about every patient, right? And so if we have advancements in some of the rarer uh, mutations in lung cancer, we still celebrate. But as we were talking earlier, we celebrate coming back from ASCO because there's so much exciting news happening. But we know we're not. We have a long way to go still.
Yeah, Dave, and I would really like to just take a moment and underscore what you've just said. So, maybe 8 to 10 years ago, we were celebrating, that we have effective therapy for those with EGFR mutations, and we have effective therapy with those who have ALK fusions. And, that was good for those subset of patients, but still sort of kind of underwhelmed with what we could do for the majority of patients who don't have EGFR and don't have ALK. And then we got the PD-1 and PD-L1 inhibitors. And that helps large groups of patients who don't have these molecular targets. But then within those patients, you had those with squamous cell subtype, and the benefits just seem to be less with those with squamous cell lung cancer. But now we appear to have an advance in that population of patients. And then that takes us also to those with small cell lung cancer, where we're beginning to really crack the code. We're starting to see new therapeutics. We're starting to see durable responses in highly refractory patients with novel therapies targeting unique proteins on the surface of these cancer cells and linking them with either chemotherapy drugs or linking them with other antibodies against immune responsive cells. And so it's good. If you have a molecular target, there's hope. If you don't have a molecular target, but you have a high PD-1 or PD-L1 positive, there's hope. If you have squamous cell cancer, there's hope. If you have small cell lung cancer, there's hope. And I really think that's the theme. It's not just hope for the sake of hope. There's a real reason to feel more hopeful today. There are real advances, and it starts with the science. It involves the world community. These are global studies. I celebrate the studies that are done in Asia and in South America and in Europe and in North America. It's a global epidemic, and it requires our full effort. And of course, it's the heroic patients. And you might say, well, are patients really heroic? Yes, they are heroic. They are diving into the unknown. They are participating in research that may or may not help them, but they're advancing knowledge. And they oftentimes do it for altruistic reasons that if it doesn't benefit me, perhaps it'll help somebody else in the future. So this is really what we can celebrate together.
Awesome. Well, as a research evangelist, I completely appreciate it, and thank you so much for sharing your takeaways from ASCO. I really appreciate it, but and I love the way you ended our conversation with the word hope. So, Dr. Hanna, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for everything that you do for the lung cancer community, and I look forward to the next time we get together.
Dave, I so appreciate you and thank you for allowing me to be with you today.
Awesome. Thank you.